My name's Carrie Castaneda Sound, and I'm a I'm a professor here at Pepperdine University in GSEP Psychology. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to share a land and labor acknowledgement. Um, as we gather for this meeting, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of land and place for the First Nations people who were here before we arrived. We occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviem, Serrano, Kizh, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging. As they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters, we recognize that their sovereignty was never ceded. We also pay respects to our elders of those of whose ancestors were enslaved and forced to work the lands stolen from their indigenous relatives for the profit of others. Their freedom was never ceded. We acknowledge the continuing damage of colonial practices and work towards respect and dignity for all. Thank you. And now at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Earl Turner, who will introduce our esteemed speaker.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today. I'm really honored actually to do this introduction as I followed his work for some time. And so he's a giant in the field of multicultural psychology. Dr. Gordon Nagayama Hall is an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Fuller Theological Seminary and started his career as a psychologist at Western State Hospital in Washington State, and later worked as a professor of psychology at Kent State University and Penn State University. Dr. Hall served as president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, Division 45 of the American Psychological Association, and president of the Asian American Psychological Association. He also served as editor of the journal Culture, Diversity, and Ethnic Minority Psychology, and author of the textbook Multicultural Psychology, which is in its 4th edition. Dr. Hall received the Lifetime Achievement Award from APA Division 45 and a APA Presidential Citation for his extraordinary leadership in advancing multicultural psychology. His research interests are in culture and mental health, with a particular interest in Asian Americans, and he currently has an NIMH grant to develop the Mind Boba problem-solving therapy app for Asian Americans. And at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Hall.
Thanks, Earl and Carrie. It's such an honor to be here, and I have such respect for both of you. And this is the end of Black History Month, and tomorrow's the beginning of Women's History Month. And your faculty member, your colleague, Dr. Tama Bryant, was the 3rd Black woman president of the American Psychological Association. So in 130 years, there have only been 5 Black presidents, and Dr. Bryant was one of them, and it was my privilege to be part of her campaign. And that presidential citation I received was from Dr. Bryant, which was one of my highest honors. So I appreciate that, and it's just great to be here at Pepperdine to spend some time with you. And I appreciate the sponsors of the event, particularly the Chinatown Service Center, where I did some work at the end of the 70s and early 80s, and I'll be talking a bit about that work today because it was influential in my own thinking. So thank you for having me, and it's just such an honor and pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking about psychotherapy for the rest of us, reducing mental health disparities via personal relevance. I'll be starting by describing what Asian American mental health disparities are. Then I'll discuss the work on cultural adaptations of psychotherapy, which is fairly extensive, and then some work that I've been doing with my colleagues on the personal relevance of psychotherapy, and then how we can address these mental health disparities with the personal relevance of psychotherapy. So Asian American mental health disparities. Who are Asian Americans? Asian Americans are about 22 million people with roots in more than 20 countries. About 60% were born in Asia. And Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic group in the United States and constitute 7% of the US population. And they're 7% of Oregon's population where I live. But in California, Asian Americans are a much higher percentage of the population, particularly here in LA County. Asian Americans are also the least likely group to use mental health services. So this was a meta-analysis or a summary of studies, 130 studies from the 1970s until 2008. And during their lifetime, only about 12 or 13% of Asian Americans ever used mental health services, whereas it was about 1 in 4 for whites, and African Americans and Latinx groups also underutilized mental health services. But Asian Americans are the least likely group to use mental health services. Mental health disparities are caused by face concerns among Asian Americans. So this is my colleague from UC Davis, Nolan Zane, who I've done quite a bit of work with over the years. And Nolan has done extensive work on face and loss of face. So face is one's social reputation based on traits, attitudes, and values one presents to others. So it's your reputation or how you're known in a community. That's face. And you can save face by fulfilling your role as a member of a group. So if you're a family member, you're a good parent, you're a good child. If you're in school, you're a good teacher, you're a good student. If you're at work, you're a good employee, you're a good colleague, you're a good supervisor. So you can save face by fulfilling your obligations in these different contexts. And you also can lose face by not fulfilling your roles in these different contexts. Mental illness prevents a person from saving face by fulfilling their roles. So if you are mentally ill, you're not able to fulfill your responsibilities as a family member or a worker or as a student. And face concerns may prevent disclosure of symptoms. So if you're concerned about face, talking about your problems, particularly mental illness or mental health problems, can cause face loss not only for you, but also for members of your family and even members of your whole community, particularly during these times of anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence. People tend to generalize from the few Asian Americans that they come in contact with and generalize to the whole group. Well, if this person is having problems and they're Asian American, gee, maybe all Asian Americans have these kinds of mental health problems. It also prevents help seeking. So if you're concerned about face loss, you're not going to seek out a situation in which there is potential for loss of face. Cultural adaptations of psychotherapy have been developed to address these mental health disparities, not only for Asian Americans, but for all groups of color. And the personal relevance of psychotherapy model that I've developed with colleagues has 3 levels: a universal level, a group level, and an individual level. Each of these is important. So the universal level, examples of this are evidence-based treatments. There's a strong focus on the internal validity of intervention. So you have laboratory studies. The social context is important. And the assumption is that these principles of healing and these methods of healing generalize to everyone. So when you learn about cognitive behavioral therapy, the assumption is that cognitive behavioral therapy applies to everyone, not just to whites or to any particular group. The group level focuses heavily on cultural context. So culturally adapted treatments are part of this group level, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And this group level focuses on the external validity of interventions. How do these interventions work in actual communities, particularly communities of color? At the individual level, those are focus on what's called precision medicine, the personal context. What works for this particular individual? So how acculturated is this person? How identified are they as an African American or an Asian American? How applicable are these treatments to this particular person? What is their worldview? How do they regard healing? What constitutes healing or mental health for this particular person, given the context in which they live, given the community in which they live? Fred Leong is another longtime colleague, and he wrote a very influential article in 1996 entitled "Toward an Integrative Model for Cross-Cultural Counseling and Psychotherapy." And Fred has argued that using any one of the three dimensions or any of the three dimensions in a unidimensional fashion has limited validity and utility in psychotherapy. So those who focus on the universal focus on their treatments as if they apply to everyone. And many of these evidence-based treatments haven't been validated with diverse groups. On the other hand, those who focus on group or culturally adapted interventions focus on a cultural group and assume that the intervention applies to every member of that group. So if you've developed a cultural adaptation for Chinese Americans, you assume that this applies to all groups. So my colleague Wei-Chen Huang has this very elegant model of cultural adaptation for Chinese Americans. And one of my Chinese American grad students, whose parents were born in Taiwan, looked at this and said, "I don't understand this." And she was Chinese American, and she could speak Chinese, but it didn't apply to her because she was fairly acculturated. And by the same token, focusing only on the individual, treating each person as an individual, ignores the context in which they live. So it's important to integrate all three of the dimensions. So the evidence-based treatment movement that focused on the universal level began in the 1990s, and this is the integration of the best research evidence with clinical expertise and patient values. And this sounds, like a good thing, and it is. Integrating clinical expertise and research evidence, and again, evidence-based treatments are assumed to be universally applicable, but the evidence base for most evidence-based treatments is primarily for one group. It's for whites. Some of these treatments have been tested with other groups, but most of the evidence base is not for people of color. Why has there been an inattention to culture in EBTs? Well, the default argument is that there's no evidence that non-adapted interventions are ineffective with diverse groups. So these treatments aren't ineffective, therefore we can continue to use them. And it's the lowest common denominator. It's like, well, if they don't do harm or if they're not ineffective, we can apply them widely rather than thinking about what's the highest standard of care? How can I help people in an optimal way rather than just giving them something that it was developed for someone else and just applying it to them? So evidence-based treatments have not or did not reduce mental health disparities. So in the 1990s to 2000s, culturally adapted treatments began to be developed, and there's two types of adaptations. One is therapist adaptations, and an example of this is client therapist ethnic matching. Stanley Sue, my friend and colleague, did some of the original work in this area. And the idea here is that if a client and therapist share the same ethnicity, the assumption is that they share the same culture, and therefore this might create a therapeutic alliance. Therapist cultural competence is another therapist adaptation. There aren't enough therapists of color for ethnic matching in all contexts. There's going to be ethnic mismatches, so perhaps therapist cultural competence would be a way for all therapists to become more effective with clients of color. And then the second general area of cultural adaptations is therapy adaptations. This involves tailoring therapy content, changing the content of therapy to make it more effective for people of color. So what does therapist-client ethnic match do in therapy? It may inexactly represent something else. It may represent a language match. So if a therapist and client share the same ethnicity, it's possible that they speak the same language, and that's pretty important. If you're non-English speaking and your client can speak your language, you can communicate. That's a basic requirement for communication. Therapist-client ethnic match might also represent cultural competence. So the therapist knows something about the culture, but ethnicity alone doesn't guarantee cultural competence. So a person may be part of an ethnic group, but may know very little about that ethnic group. So ethnic match alone isn't necessarily a guarantee of cultural competence. Ethnic match may prevent premature termination. So clients need to attend several sessions to experience a therapeutic dosage. And so seeing a therapist of your own ethnicity in the first session may reassure the client that there's someone here that looks like me and maybe that person can help me. So it may prevent premature termination. But over time in therapy, client-therapist ethnic match has limited effects on therapy outcome or improvement. So deeper components such as cultural adaptations of the treatment might affect outcome more than having a client-therapist ethnic match. So client-therapist ethnic match is important and creates some traction, but it's not sufficient to reduce mental health disparities. Cultural competence is another approach to cultural adaptation. And this is Joyce Chu, and she and Stan Su and some of their colleagues did work on cultural competence, which typically involves cultural awareness, knowledge of a client's cultural background and skills. So cultural awareness is an awareness of your own personal values as well as the personal biases that you might have. Knowledge involves the client's cultural background, the client's worldview, and the client's therapy expectations, which may or may not match one's own. And then finally, skills is the ability to use this knowledge and awareness to provide culturally relevant and sensitive treatment. So what are the effects of cultural competence? Well, across studies, therapists' perceptions of their own cultural competence are not associated with their clients' experiences in therapy. So why do you think that might be? Just for a minute. Why might therapists' perceptions of their own cultural competence not be associated with their clients' experiences in therapy, clients' improvement? I don't know how I asked the people online, but, or anyone. Why might a therapist's own perception of the cultural competence not be associated with client improvement? What's that? Yeah, I mean, the therapist may not be very accurate. I think everybody everybody wants to, who wouldn't want to be culturally, what therapist is going to say, well, I'm not very, well, maybe someone would say that. I mean, that might be what you get at with cultural humility. I mean, that might be a good thing, but most people want to feel like they're competent, particularly if they've taken a class or, had some training. What does make a difference is clients' perceptions of therapist cultural competence. So clients' perceptions of therapist cultural competence are associated with longer participation in therapy, and they're mildly associated with treatment outcomes. So cultural competence has some positive effects, but this is also not sufficient to reduce mental health disparities. This is Guillermo Bernal. He's in Puerto Rico, and he defined cultural adaptations in 2009 as a systematic modification of an evidence-based treatment or intervention protocol to consider language, culture, and context in such a way that is compatible with the client's cultural patterns, meanings, and values. And if you read Guillermo's work, it's very comprehensive, and he has specific procedures and methods to culturally adapted treatment, and he has ways to measure it as well. And so this was a meta-analysis that my colleagues and I did in 2016, and this is a plot that shows that culturally adapted interventions are more effective than non-adapted interventions. So the effect size was about three-quarters better than non-adapted treatments. So you're seeing all these plots, all these studies, and so they are greater than zero. And so culturally adapted interventions are more effective than non-adapted interventions. And that was 78 studies over several decades. So culturally adapted interventions work. They're more effective than non-adapted interventions. But culturally adapted treatments also have not reduced mental health disparities. They work, but they haven't reduced this persistent problem of mental health disparities. Part of this is the limited availability of culturally adapted treatments. They're not widely available, and they're complex. So to Guillermo's credit, he's very comprehensive and systematic about adapting, but most people don't have the skill or the time to do these adaptations, and some people just give up or just do what they typically do rather than trying to do something that seems beyond their abilities. Also, culturally adapted treatments are broadly applied to address cultural features associated with a particular group. So getting back to my grad student who was Chinese American, even though this intervention had been adapted for Chinese Americans, it didn't particularly apply to her. So not everybody in the group is going to be the same. There's a lot of variability within and across Asian American groups, for example. And so a therapy developed for Chinese Americans isn't necessarily going to apply to other groups or to, all Chinese Americans. It also may not, and so these culturally adapted treatments may not adequately address individual diversity within a group. And so a person may be very acculturated and want the standard therapy, or they may be very unacculturated and want something that is very culturally based. So unfortunately, culturally adapted treatments have evolved into a one-size-fits-all approach similar to the evidence-based treatments. So in 2021, my colleagues and I had an article in the American Psychologist on personal relevance, and uh, Dr. Carey, I think, said you've used this, or at least you read it. So, so which is, I'm happy. But anyway, this was an article where we wanted to determine how meaningful and useful an intervention is to a particular person. So this is this precision medicine approach. So personal relevance is whether the treatment approach being used is seen as credible and matches clients' belief systems and perceptions of what should be beneficial to them. So does this particular intervention fit for this particular client? So I think the inspiration for this group happened at Chinatown Service Center. So this was a long time ago. As I said, the end of the 70s and beginning of the 1980s at Chinatown Service Center. So I was referred this case as a 13-year-old Chinese American immigrant. I'm calling him John. That wasn't his actual name. And he was sent to juvenile hall for stealing school supplies. And so he was referred to Chinatown Service Center, where I was. And when I met John, he was very embarrassed and remorseful and didn't want to talk about his problems. He just felt terrible. And I think this is a situation where there's tremendous face loss for what he did. And he felt bad and didn't really want to talk about this situation. He felt very embarrassed. And so I tried to focus the therapy on his decision making. You know, what was the process by which he decided to do this? How could he prevent this from happening again? But he wasn't exactly receptive to that approach. So what should I do? He's not receptive to this approach. It's very remorseful. Remorse alone probably isn't going to prevent him from having problems in the future. So what would you actually, you're at Chinatown Service Center, you probably have a better idea about what I did 40 years ago. But what would you do with this person? He just wasn't, he wasn't very engaged in what we were trying to do. And I know some of you are experts on children and adolescents. How can we help this person? How would you try to engage him? Yeah, anyone can. Yeah, Earl.
I mean, I might try motivation interviewing because he's a
Uh-huh.
adolescent and see how that might engage him and help change his behavior.
Yeah, motivational interviewing. So this was the late 70s when actually motivational interviewing was just being developed at University of Oregon, where I am now, but we didn't know about it. Bill Miller was the person. He was a few years ahead of me, and I was, I didn't know, but motivational interviewing is a good idea, kind of thinking about what you want, where you are, where you would like to be, how that differs, how you can get to where he did want to stay. He wanted to stay out of trouble. No question about that. He felt very embarrassed. He didn't want this to happen again. He felt, embarrassed for his family and himself. And so that's a good idea. Maybe thinking about how to get him engaged and how to think about what he wants and how he could get there. So there's a person-centered approach. So Irene says a person-centered approach. Wenting says I will try to have more conversations about his family relationships and values. Okay, good ideas. Wish I had those ideas at the time, and I wish that motivational interviewing had been developed. Well, so what happened is that there was a chess set in Chinatown Service Center. Maybe it's still there. I don't know. But so this client, who I'm calling John, wanted to play chess. I mean, I didn't say, hey, let's play chess. He said, yeah, I just trying to do anything to engage him. And so he liked playing chess. And when he first started playing chess, he's very impulsive and he'd lose. And I tried to go a little bit easy on him, but I wanted him to, we were actually playing chess. And then he actually improved. And this allowed him to take the focus away from himself and engage with me in a way. And his chess skills over time improved. And he realized himself that being mindful of chess moves was similar to being mindful of life decisions. I mean, he said this. I mean, this was not something I thought of. He said it to me. He goes, "Hey, maybe chess is like therapy." And I said, "Yeah, maybe it is." So this just happened serendipitously, but it was a problem-solving approach that had some meaning to him. So this problem-solving approach involved playing chess, and playing chess allowed him to save face by indirectly addressing his problems. So, losing in chess wasn't a big deal. It was a game, and he treated it as such. We're kind of having fun and we're engaged. But I think the effective component of playing chess was that it was a way of solving problems and showing that a deliberative, planful approach to problem solving is probably going to be better than just feeling bad and saying I'm not going to do it again. Okay, so more on the personal relevance of psychotherapy. So it's this precision medicine approach trying to figure out a particularly relevant approach for a particular person. Stan Su and Nolan Zane, who I've mentioned, had a classic American Psychologist article in 1987, and they focused on credibility and giving. So credibility is whether the treatment is perceived by the client as beneficial. Is the therapy something for me? Is there something that I can get out of this? And then giving involves whether the treatment is perceived by the client as practical. Am I going to get something? So not only in theory is this beneficial, but will this help me? Is there something practical that I can get out of this? So the therapist can provide an immediate, practical, symbolic gift to the client. And this might be symptom relief, showing the client that they can feel better if they follow, if they do X, Y, and Z, and some reassurance that they can improve, that there's some hope for them. This is a symbolic gift. I have this picture. I'm not talking about actually giving a gift to someone who was with these psychiatrists, and in the Q&A, they said, well, I'm not sure you should actually give a gift to a person. I'm thinking, okay, were you sleeping through this and you just saw the picture of a gift? So it's a symbolic gift, but a gift nonetheless. And this is something that's very common and important in Asian and Asian American cultures. When you go to someone's home, you bring some kind of gift, food or some other kind of gift for the person's family or their children. And in Japan, it's called omiyage, and it's something that is expected and it is part of many Asian cultures, particularly East Asian cultures. So when a client comes to therapy, they expect some kind of benefit. And if you don't provide that benefit, that could lead to dropping out. That may be why these high dropout rates among Asian Americans, they didn't get this gift, this immediate practical gift in treatment. So this is Jin Kim. She worked with Nolan Zane, and she and Nolan did some important work on the credibility of therapy. Again, Asian Americans are the least likely ethnic group to seek mental health services. And relative to white Americans, Asian Americans view therapy as less credible, and they also have lower intentions to seek help. And that makes sense. A person who doesn't see a treatment or a therapy as credible is probably not going to want to seek treatment if they believe treatment is not credible in general. And as you might guess, credibility and health-seeking intentions are correlated. So if a treatment is seen as not credible, you're not going to seek help. On the other hand, if a treatment is seen as credible, you're more likely to seek help. Personally relevant psychotherapy involves approaching personal issues as solving specific So approaching personal issues as solving specific external problems saves face and provides a practical gift. So if mental health problems, if mental illness is seen as problem solving, they're external problems. They aren't something internal. There's something that I can work on, and I can save face. This is going to be a gift. And so if I can improve my family functioning, my school functioning, my work functioning, if the therapy focuses on that, this takes the focus away from me as an individual and helps me fulfill my obligations and my role. So this is an fMRI machine, and this is some work that I did with my social neuroscience colleague at the University of Oregon, Elliot Berkman. And I'll admit I spent probably most of my career being a skeptic of neuroscience. And in one of the previous versions of my multicultural psychology textbook, I had this section on, can there be too much neuroscience? And I was a critic of neuroscience and fMRI, but Elliot Berkman is really a brilliant colleague, and we talked, and I told him about some of my ideas and this idea of personal relevance, and he said, we can actually measure that. We can do a proof of concept study. So I'll show you what we did. This is from social psychology, the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. So in this model, there's peripheral and central processing, and might be something you remember from intro psychology, or if you've had a social psychology course. But peripheral processing involves low message engagement and a low likelihood of attitude change. So if you think of the kind of ads you get on social media, if you're a young person shopping for clothing, you're probably not going to pay attention to these ads for retirement homes. They often send to me, and I don't pay attention to them either. But what you probably will pay attention to is something involving what you're interested in, clothing, or something relevant to you, maybe rock climbing or something that is more relevant to you. So central processing involves high message engagement, a high likelihood of attitude change. So when you see this clothing, you're looking for clothing, and there's a match there, there's a likelihood, if you're paying attention, that you might actually buy this clothing. Actually, this happened to my daughter. She's a graduate of the University of Washington, and Lululemon had a line of clothing for the University of Washington. I said, look at this. And she bought it. I mean, I said it to her sort of as a joke, and she said, this is great. I'm going to buy this stuff. And, for me, it was peripheral processing. For her, it was central processing. She liked Lululemon years ago, and she was a University of Washington graduate, and so she bought this clothing. But when there's central processing, this can actually be measured in the brain. So there's neural activation in attention and self-processing networks when there's central processing. So so the goal in therapy is to have the message or the therapy content focus or activate central processing. So these self-processing networks are the medial prefrontal and posterior cingulate cortices. And these are implicated in processing of persuasive messages. So we can actually measure brain response to see whether a message has engaged central or peripheral processing. So we can actually do this with the fMRI, as I showed you before, the machine. So this is Eugene. This is where I live. This is a sunny day, which we don't have many of, but this is kind of a nice spring day, and this is where I do my work. And in our work with Nolan Zane, Elliot Berkman, we wanted to compare cognitive behavior therapy, which is the standard mainstream evidence-based treatment approach, with problem-solving therapy. And the reason we did this was to compare the face loss potential and relevance to Asian Americans. So CBT focuses on thoughts and feelings. You're probably familiar with it. And there's also tremendous face loss potential because of the self-focus. A focus on one's thoughts and feelings creates the locus of a problem on oneself. It's an internal problem. Mental health problems, mental illness resides within me. There's something wrong with me. Therefore, I'm going to lose face. And not only am I going to lose face, and my family's going to lose face because they didn't take care of me and my community didn't take care of me, and so forth. So there's potential for face loss with cognitive behavioral therapy. Problem-solving therapy was developed by Art Nezu and his colleagues in the 1980s, and there was a focus on goal setting and external problem solving. And this creates the potential to save face. And problem solving therapy may be personally relevant to many Asian Americans, particularly those who are unacculturated. So I'm having problems learning English, or I have an accent and my colleagues don't take me seriously, or maybe I am an Asian American and language isn't my problem, but I'm having problems being taken seriously, or people treat me as invisible, or they mistake me for the other Asian American that's working in the same department. So how do I address these types of problems, these practical problems at work or at school or in my family? So our hypothesis was that the personal relevance of problem-solving therapy would be greater than that of cognitive behavior therapy, because external problem solving allows the client to save face. So focus on family, work, school issues, solving problems in those contexts is less focus on the self and more focus on the context and trying to improve functioning in those contexts. And external problem solving can provide a symbolic gift. It's something immediately practical. So the client comes to the therapist, they focus on problem solving, they give homework that the client can work on right away. And so there's some immediate relief and some immediate reassurance that they're going to improve. So the brain imaging work. So we studied 28 Asian Americans in Eugene, Oregon. We had first generation Asian born, second generation US born, and third generation who were US born and their parents are US born. And we randomly ordered excerpts of CBT or PST treatment manuals and presented them in the fMRI scanner. And fMRI is brain imaging while a participant is engaged in a task. So maybe you've had an MRI for something, and maybe actually some of you have had an fMRI in a study. But this is brain imaging while a participant is engaged in a task, such as reading excerpts from these treatment manuals. So we look at brain response while the person is involved in a task. So this was an excerpt from CBT. When we look at your thoughts, sometimes they're true, not true, or have a grain of truth. We will teach you how to evaluate the accuracy of your thoughts by looking at the evidence. What evidence is there that the thought is true? What evidence is there that the thought is not true? So this is your standard CBT approach. PST was more problem focused. So one skill that may help you is a generation of alternatives in which we will teach you to use your creative skills to brainstorm different types of solutions. You will come up with as many solutions as you can. Not all will be the best solution, but it helps you think of alternatives. For example, if you're struggling to talk to your roommate about cleaning up after themselves, you can use the brainstorming tool to discover that there are many ways to get closer to your goal and get past the obstacles in your way. So the focus is very practical. So this is a summary of multiple brain images from this study. And what this actually shows, there's this section, if I have a pointer, there's sort of a pointer, which probably no one could see. But this area of the brain, which is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, showed much more activity in response to problem-solving therapy than in response to cognitive behavior therapy. And this was across the board. And the people in the study didn't know that these excerpts were from one approach or another. We didn't say this is CBT and this is problem solving. We just had multiple excerpts from both approaches. And this is a proof of concept. So problem-solving therapy elicited much more prefrontal cortex activity among these Asian Americans than did cognitive behavioral therapy. And this was more pronounced for first and second generation Asian Americans. So those who are born in Asia or those whose parents are born in Asia showed more of a contrast, more of a preference in terms of brain response for problem-solving therapy than cognitive behavioral therapy. The third generation, those who are more acculturated, there was less preference. One was, there was still a preference for problem-solving therapy, but the preference was less pronounced. So this shows that even within a group, and this is a small group of people, but this is a pretty clear pattern that even within a group of Asian Americans, there's some generational and acculturation differences. So the question is whether this preference for problem-solving therapy is specific to Asian Americans or is a general phenomenon. We ran out of money to do brain imaging, but my former student, Ellen Huang, did a dissertation looking at whether problem-solving therapy had greater personal relevance to Asian Americans and to European Americans. And there was self-report of PST and CBT vignettes of personal relevance, how personally relevant was it, how much did they like it, and how helpful was it. For European Americans, there was a slight preference for problem-solving therapy, but this is not statistically significant. So basically, European Americans saw PST as being about as relevant, and they liked it, and it was about as helpful as CBT. So both were essentially equal. For Asian Americans, there was a more clear preference based on self-report for problem-solving therapy. Asian Americans saw problem-solving therapy as more personally relevant. They liked it more, and it was more helpful. So based on the self-report data, it appears that this preference for the personal relevance of problem-solving therapy was specific to Asian Americans. So some of these personal relevance studies is that neural activation self-report suggests that a pragmatic treatment approach was more personally relevant to Asian Americans, and a self-focus approach, the PST greater than CBT neural response was more pronounced for immigrants and their children, and self-report indicates that PST is greater than CBT in personal relevance for Asian Americans, but not for European Americans. So this appears to be, this preference for PST appears to be specific to Asian Americans. So again, how do we apply this? How do we try to integrate the universal group and individual? Stan Su, another classic American psychologist, article discussed dynamic sizing. This considers how universal healing principles in group cultural contexts influence individuals and can be implemented to assess the personal relevance and effectiveness of intervention. This is a computer concept of dynamic sizing, fitting a particular approach to an individual. And consideration of all three of these levels of influence doesn't always necessitate cultural adaptation. Sometimes existing treatments that aren't culturally adapted might be applicable if they address a person's face concerns. And problem-solving therapy, I think, is one of these treatments that that we didn't adapt, at least in these studies. And basically, the assumptions or the approaches and methods of PST might be personally relevant for many Asian Americans. So, as Earl said in the introduction, I've been developing an app with colleagues to address stress among Asian Americans. It's based on problem-solving therapy. We have the great privilege of having Art Nezu and Chris Nezu, the developers of the approach, working with us on this app. And there's Chris and Art. And it's the advantage of an app is that it's widely accessible. It can be on your the privacy reduces stigma and safe space. So a person could just work on their phone in this app privately. Nobody needs to know that they're doing this. Their family members don't need to know about this. They don't have to actually go into a clinic and talk to someone. There's an Asian American cultural context, as you'll see in our app. And there's a focus on practical problems. There's homework assignments that result in a sense of accomplishment and progress. So Mind Boba is the symbol and of the approach. We have these different characters. There's these Asian images. It's like you're drinking boba, which is popular among a lot of Asian Americans. And there's these three different characters, and then there's this panda, which is kind of an Asian character that guides the user through these scenarios, and these three persons, who are all Asian Americans, are presented as having different types of issues, and they're portrayed as addressing these issues with this Mind Boba app. And here's one of the modules. There's a solution mission focusing on solutions, brain boosters, getting your ideas about brainstorming, thinking about different potential solutions, motivation station. Yeah. My mic's, oh, okay, sorry. I'm not taking the mic. Okay, so this is one of the modules. So focusing on solutions, brain boosters, which is problem solving or brainstorming, motivation station, and this is where, as Dr. Earl suggested earlier, motivational interviewing. Why are you doing this? What do you want as an outcome? Where are you now? Where do you want to be? And then emotion exploration as well. Emotions are an important part of this. This isn't just problem solving without emotion. Chris and Art Nezu have developed the latest version of problem solving therapy involves emotion focused problem solving therapy. So emotions are an important component of this as well. And so one might set goals, brainstorm solutions, create a plan, and reflect. So this is one of the modules. And if you do all these things, you'll be happily drinking boba like this panda. We're starting a randomized clinical trial. You can scan this QR code, or mindboba.com is where people can learn about this. We're looking for Chinese Americans for this randomized clinical trial. This is because that's what we were funded to study. Also, many of these principles apply to Chinese Americans. We hope to expand this in different iterations, but at this point, we're looking for Chinese Americans. So if you are a Chinese American or know of Chinese Americans who might be interested, mindboba.com. So some conclusions. Asian Americans continue to be the least likely group to use mental health services, and this has persisted for decades, since the 1970s when it was first identified. Asian Americans are diverse. So Asian Americans consist of very different types of people. not one approach is going to apply to everyone. Even an approach that's developed for a particular group, such as Chinese Americans, isn't going to apply to all Chinese Americans. But personally relevant therapy that addresses practical problems can attract Asian Americans to therapy and has the potential to be effective. So any therapist can focus on practical issues to help get their Asian American clients engaged. Want to put in a plug for the Disorient Asian American Film Festival that I'm on the board of directors for. This is an independent Asian American film festival in Eugene, but there's also a virtual festival March 11th through 17th. And we're a social justice organization, and you're going to find all kinds of just fantastic films. Some are documentaries, some are comedies, some are rom-coms. There's music videos. There's even a horror component. I mean, I have to review these films as a board member, and I'm looking at these horror films, and I'm thinking, I mean, I know that's a genre, and it's very developed, and some look really good, but I'm thinking, I don't get this. But we have a horror component. There's Korean American shorts, Filipino American films. There's some bigger budget films. There's some smaller films, long films, short films. So if you're interested, www.disorientfilm.org, you can tune into the virtual festival March 11th through 17th, or if you're in Eugene, you can actually come and see the films in person. So thank you. I'll stop here, and we can go to discussion. So actually, I see some. Okay, suppose an Asian American client is struggling with the language barrier and feels like their voices are not taken seriously. What treatment would you recommend? I think the problem with language barriers can't easily be solved. Yeah, that's a really good good point. So part of the issue is that language fluency is not equivalent to intelligence. And I think often when a person can't speak English well in an English dominant setting, the assumption by some is that this person isn't very smart. Well, that is not true. So that's where you might start with a problem-solving approach. And then think about, okay, well, do I have some allies within this group that can help me, that I can talk with, and that I can actually practice with? So if it's a group meeting and you have some people that you know, you might think about, okay, who can help me with this? Who can I talk to talk about with these issues, and who can I maybe practice on if I'm trying to improve my skills? Or it might even involve, and that might lend an opportunity with a friendly audience for speaking and just practicing English. But there's systemic issues that might need to be addressed too. How are people whose first language is not English, how are they regarded in this organization? What are we doing to try to support them and include them? And so some of the onus might be on the organization. So there's a number of components to it. It's not just going to classes to improve English, although that might be part of it. It's working with colleagues, it's working with the system, it might even be changing the system. And of course, changing the system is a bigger task, but all of those might be components of a problem-solving approach. And again, the problem isn't within the individual that they can't speak English. Sure, maybe they can try to improve their English, but that doesn't mean that they can't communicate and don't have intelligence and can't contribute. And so the idea of the problem-solving approach might be to try to find the best way that they can contribute, given who they are. Perhaps that means involving, improving English, but perhaps not, just contributing with the skills that they have, and having the group or the organization be more inclusive. So from the PST greater than CBT research, what are some reasons did your team hypothesize as to why there was a difference between first, second, and third generation participants? I think that difference was probably acculturation. So immigrants that come to the country are focused on practical problems in life. I need to learn English, or I need to be successful at my job. I need to succeed. I need to take care of my children. I need to make sure my children are safe. So I think some of those practical considerations are probably more urgent and more salient for immigrants, whereas for more acculturated Asian Americans, there isn't a language issue. They're more integrated into the mainstream. And so, and, maybe they've taken a class in college where they learned about psychotherapy and CBT, and they might think that, this is something that is useful to me. So I think that might be part of the reason for this generational difference. It might be acculturation. It might be just the types of problems that are urgent and salient. How can the therapists help with face saving while addressing trauma with Asian clients? So that's a huge problem, and that's Tama, and Tama probably can tell you much more about trauma than I can, but and trauma is certainly a source of potential face loss, a huge potential source of face loss for a person if they're a victim of abuse, and the abuser is a family member, or even if it isn't a family member, someone in the community. There's potential face loss for the whole family or the whole community, and I think starting with validating that person and taking them seriously and respecting them, and this is maybe where cultural humility comes in, just trying to understand that person in their context and why it may be particularly difficult to address trauma. That might be a place to start, just validating the person, being supportive, and then finding out what can be done and what it means to acknowledge trauma and what it means to recover from trauma in this particular cultural context. So does this mean that I have to separate myself from family members or my community? And if I do that, who's going to support me? Are there other members of my family? Are there others in my community who will be supportive? Can I identify and find those people? Or maybe it just means making a break with a community because there's just dysfunction, which for many Asian Americans, if they're really tied to a community, that's a huge step to take. So this is, and actually, Dr. Tama, I'd be interested in kind of your thoughts on this, and she could probably share this with you, since she's here. But those are some initial thoughts, just validating the person and then finding what this means in this context, what the solution is going to be, and then how the community can help them, or maybe if the community is harmful, where else they can seek support, maybe other parts of the community or maybe other communities. Okay, any other questions here? Yes, go.
Yeah, I was interested by the difference in one of the studies on those Asian Americans who were acculturated versus not acculturated. And my question is have you done or have you heard about any research on the effectiveness of evidence-based therapies the differences between acculturated Asian Americans and white Americans or any other group. Yeah.
That's actually a very sophisticated question. I mean, that would be the logical step. Look at levels of acculturation within clients and see if the approach is more effective with one group or another. Unfortunately, that hasn't been done. There have been very few studies, evidence-based studies across all therapies of Asian Americans, and typically it's a handful, fewer than 30, and acculturation. If you've got 10 people, and there's some variation, you're not going to find large enough ends to actually find a difference. But that's a logical question. I think also the evidence-based movement is intent on showing that their approach works. So they're not that interested in variability within a group, even if it's going to benefit a group. Well, I think they're concerned that, well, if this is less effective for some group, they're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that's a good question. I mean, again, based on what we know in some of these preliminary studies, for an acculturated person, CBT might be as effective as PST, depending on what the problem is. So I think this is where the precision medicine comes in. For this particular client, how acculturated are they? How much have they learned about psychotherapy or psychology? And if they're very aware of these things, they may have taken a class in college where they learned about CBT, and they may see that approach is very relevant to them. So this isn't to say that CBT for all Asian Americans is less effective, because for some Asian Americans, it may be very effective and may be the treatment of choice. But that's just a question that we just don't have data for, unfortunately.
Thank you. My head's spinning with questions, so I have to pick which one. I think what I'm trying to figure out is the precision medicine part in terms of how can this inform our assessments or intakes, basically intakes, to say, is this, a client that I need to do this with or that with? And so it sounds like acculturation level is one area we can assess. Would you think of anything else? Like, how do I know that face savings can be really relevant for my one client?
Yeah, there's, this can be done formally or informally. Nolan Zane has a loss of face measure, and you can see how much a person is actually concerned about loss of face. But that kind of assessment can be conducted somewhat less formally, just talking about how connected they are to their family and how their parents or their family members regard them. Do they see them as successful, or is there a high bar for success? And if a person is really wedded to these types of cultural expectations, loss of face is probably going to be pretty important for them. If they're less connected to these cultural expectations, loss of face may be less important for them. But for many Asian Americans, this is something that's important. And I think sometimes mainstream therapists can't understand why adult Asian Americans are so concerned about what their parents think. And this is because they're connected to a culture. And this isn't just specific to Asian Americans, but many Asian Americans are connected to their families, and their family's view of them is very important to them. And disappointing one's family can result in face loss. And even if they are acculturated and aren't as apparently concerned about face loss, it still can have an effect. So in some of the studies we've done, face loss is prominent among even fourth generation Asian Americans. So fourth generation Asian Americans are people whose great grandparents came from the United States, or their parents were born in the United States. Their grandparents are born in the United States. Their parents are born in the United States. They were born in the United States. So their grandparents might have come from an Asian country generations ago, but there's still these concerns about loss of face. So it's something that is very persistent and pervasive. But that's not to say that all Asian Americans are concerned about loss of face. But if an Asian American client is attuned to these cultural expectations, and is concerned about violating these expectations, that is something to be attuned to. Is that make sense? Yeah.
It's a really great presentation. I had a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned that Asian Americans are one of the least likely groups to use therapy.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering, a lot of literature does talk about client-therapist matching, and obviously because of demographics of the profession, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, with the loss of face that you were discussing, does that change when, let's say, an Asian American is matched with someone of their same ethnic group? And how does maybe even acculturation factor into that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So sometimes face loss is actually less with a client, with a therapist, where there's a ethnic mismatch. So if the therapist is not someone from your community, you can be more honest about things, and you might take them more seriously. Here's a person from the outside. So some Asian Americans might actually prefer a therapist of a different ethnicity because it gives them sort of an objective person who isn't part of the community, and someone who can kind of evaluate from a non-biased perspective what loss of face is about. Am I being overly concerned about this? But this is a delicate balance. It's when I was a grad student, I wrote my dissertation on what I called cultural control in psychotherapy. So psychotherapy can actually be an acculturative process and can actually at times be a coercive process. So I think it's good to have an objective person from outside one's group look at a person. So it's kind of like, if you're having family issues, sometimes you want to talk to someone outside your family. Sometimes they're a good sounding board. I think we all want that at sometimes, but the danger there is if the therapist doesn't have cultural humility, they might inadvertently or maybe advertently acculturate the person in a way that's not necessary. In fact, I gave a talk about loss of face, and in an earlier part of my career, I was doing work on sexual aggression. And what I found with Asian American men is that those who were concerned about loss of face were least likely to be sexually aggressive against women. So this was a positive aspect of loss of face. And so I was giving this talk, and this operated for Asian Americans and not for white men. So this was a positive aspect of loss of face, being concerned about others' welfare because you're part of the group. And so after I gave this talk, this person in the audience, who's a pretty well-known cognitive behavioral expert, said, "Why don't they get over it?" I mean, she said, "Why don't they get over loss of face?" I'm thinking, did you not hear that, that this could be, you don't want to have them get over it or acculturate them. You want to capitalize on loss of face as a protective factor against sexual aggression. So, I mean, that's an extreme example, but I think a therapist from a group that is not Asian American working with an Asian American, that can be beneficial, but it's a delicate situation. And again, I think if someone has cultural humility and is trying to serve as a sounding board rather than trying to unduly influence a person, that could be that could be beneficial. So I think that's an excellent question. Again, because we have so few studies and we can't look at within group variability to a large degree. That question, hasn't been fully explored. But I think, that's an excellent question about how. So basically, I think that non-Asian therapists can be beneficial to Asian Americans and can be beneficial in some ways that Asian American therapists can't be. And it's similar to being a family member. You're part of the family. You see things a certain way, and it's kind of hard for you to look outside. Okay, so how does the therapist address their own implicit bias? That's a really great question. You're probably all familiar with implicit bias. These are just often stereotypes we have of different groups, and they're just they're ingrained within us, and even though we would explicitly eschew a stereotype of Asian Americans being smart or successful or healthy, sometimes those implicit biases actually exist. And so I guess the question was, how would you deal with thanks. How does a therapist address their own implicit bias? I think part of it is to be aware of what the implicit bias might be and own the fact that everybody has implicit biases, and that there are stereotypes of Asian Americans that we're all susceptible to. And Asian Americans themselves are susceptible to these biases because we've been socialized in a culture that creates these biases. So I think the first thing to do is be aware of these biases and learn about them, and then make some efforts to counter these biases. And particularly if you're a therapist and have an Asian American client, be aware of what these biases are and have cultural humility. Try to listen to the client and treat them as an individual that is an Asian American in a cultural context, but think about this person and how I can help them in their particular context, rather than treating them as, well, Asian Americans do this, or Asian Americans defer to authority, so I'm going to that kind of stereotype is not going to be helpful. So just being aware of what the biases are can and trying to counteract them can help. Okay.
So now I have language, but for what you were talking about, the activating central processing.
Yeah. Right.
That just, now I'm just really thinking about across the lifespan, how that looks different for everyone. And that was fascinating. That was a fascinating study.
Yeah, that's another aspect to this. It's a lifespan approach. So what is personally relevant for an elementary school kid, or for an adolescent, or for a young adult, or for an elderly? Those are going to be different across the lifespan. So you can take a group of Asian Americans and of different ages, and depending on their age and their experiences, they're going to have very different types there's going to be very different types of personally relevant issues to them. And they're all Asian Americans, but they could all be Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans. But because of the cohort that they're in, that could really be very, very different. So the key with this precision medicine approach is to find out, consider life or consider developmental period. Where are you? What is relevant here? What, and a 70-year-old is going to have very different experiences than a 10-year-old, just because they've had, and yet they can both be Asian Americans and still, be part of the same group. Yet, what is personally relevant for a kid is going to be very different than what's relevant for an elder. That's a good point. And this to me was, I remember Elliot Berkman said, "This is a slam dunk." He told us, and I'm thinking, okay, I didn't know what to expect. And he has, he has his fMRI equipment, and it's a huge amount of that's the most scientific I've ever felt, even though I was sort of, the sidekick on the neuroscience part. So this was, a proof of concept study. It just happened to neatly line up with what our hypotheses were, and we didn't know. We didn't have preliminary data. We just, we just put our heads together and used our knowledge and thought, here's what potentially could happen. But this, and in terms of therapy, we can't have an fMRI machine in every therapy office or anything like that. And since funding is so limited, I'm not sure where this neuroimaging work will go in the future. But it was pretty fascinating to know that there's an area of the brain that where when it's activated, that indicates central processing. I mean, that's pretty amazing to me. Yes.
Question. No, nobody else. No. Okay. Yeah. So with the participants, excuse me, that were part of your study, I'm curious, do you have, did you gather the data around what types of specific ethnicities they were, or as well as their, like the context of their immigration, right? Because there's some who immigrate, for choice and some who are coming through as refugees.
That's a really good question. We had they were mostly East Asian. They weren't all one group. It was mostly East Asian, and it was 30 people. So we couldn't do two. We just had to make these kind of broad categories, which was not less than optimal. So doing it the way you're suggestion would be better, and would be better to have a larger group. I found out when we did that study, this study of 30 Asian Americans is the largest neuroimaging study of Asian Americans ever. I mean, which shows you how pathetic this area is. I mean, 30 Asian Americans is the largest neuroimaging study. So, and then we tried to get more money for a neuroimaging study. We didn't get it. So I, got approached by these colleagues who wanted to develop this app, and we're not doing neuroimaging. I mean, there's a lot to be explored that may not be explored unless NIH or NIMH changes their priorities. So that's my political soapbox. Well, that's a good question. So I mean, it almost sounds like an excuse. Well, that's a good question, but it hasn't been done. It hasn't been done because there hasn't been funding. And this is not just my opinion. Over the past 25 years, only 0.17% of the whole NIH budget. This isn't just NIMH. This is the whole NIH budget. Less than 1%, 0.17% of all NIH funding has been given to studies with a focus on Asian Americans. And this is all studies: cancer, circulatory problems, AIDS, mental health. So that's why we don't know much about this, is that there hasn't been funding for this type of research. So what we do know is a credit to a few intrepid researchers who've just decided, sometimes without funding, to try to get data. So this, we got internal funding for this fMRI study from the University of Oregon, and then that was hopefully seed money to get federal funding, and we just hit a brick wall. And it's not as if we didn't have experts in neuroscience. I mean, Elliot Bergman has just a stellar record and long track record of funding. And but the difference this time was that we're going to study Asian Americans, and just it wasn't seen as enough of a priority, unfortunately.
Thank you.
You're welcome. No questions here. Hi, Miguel. Nice to see you.
Well, he said
Hey,
he's
Gordy. Hey, Gordy. Good to see you too.
Yeah. He said his daughter's with him, and
Yeah, they're in and out listening. They love you, by the way.
okay.
Okay. Thanks. Hey, thank you for coming.
Oh
Really
yeah, thank you, Miguel. So
Yeah.
I was telling you shouldn't subject your poor daughters to me. So I said I have 3 adult children, 2 daughters and a son. The 2 daughters have had to hear me somewhere at some point in time, but my son managed to escape ever hearing me give a talk. And he lives in Marina del Rey, so I'm visiting this weekend. So he's working tonight, so he had a convenient excuse not to come to this. But anyway, thanks, Miguel, for being here. Thank you for. I mean, this has been a lot of fun, and I have much respect for Pepperdine in this program, and for your faculty and students, and it's just been a delight to be here.
Yes. Well, thank you. Yeah, we've loved it. And I can share for myself, it's always fun to meet someone, you read their work, and then to really get to know them as a person. And you didn't disappoint, for sure. And I really appreciate it. And in my culture, giving gifts is important as well. And so here's a little something from us at Pepperdine.
Okay.
It's just so inspiring to see that, for decades, it was raising the alarm that these exist, but it's so exciting and inspiring to see the changes that with creativity and everything that are being proposed, things that we can do. And that is what we need more of. And thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, we can do this together. I mean, I remember as a graduate student, 40 years ago, even when I was at Chinatown Service Center, wherever I was, I'm thinking these problems seem insurmountable. And my contribution to this is probably going to be pretty small, or maybe, I had some doubts about whether I could do this at all. But what I've found over the years is just some great colleagues such as Nolan Zane and Stan Su, and more broadly in APA and Division 45, with the Culture, Ethnicity, and Race Division, where I found some great colleagues that I know here at Pepperdine. And this has been a corporate effort, and I really feel like we can change science, change society, change therapy for the better. I really think we have momentum, and I want to encourage everyone to be optimistic about what you can do, and know that working together we can make change.
Thank you. I'm going to give a quick shout out to our tech team, who has done an amazing job. Thank you. Fabulous.
Sorry, real quick, Dr. Hall and Dr. Costanza Sound. Dr. Tama Bryant has her hand raised in the chat.
Yes, if you can hear me, I just
Yes.
want to say thank you so much for your scholarship and for your support. And I want this community to know that you are such an incredible example of using your privilege in order to position others. And I want them to know that both myself, our current president, Cynthia De La Fuentes, our incoming president, Deborah Kawahara, that all 3 of us are indebted to you for the ways that you worked for our campaign. And as you mentioned in the beginning, we're about to go into Women's History Month. And so to have these 3 women about to serve the association back to back, I am so immensely grateful to you. and am appreciative of the ways you show up, not only in terms of the writing, but in terms of living it out. And you give us hope.
Well, thank you, Tim. I can't think of a greater compliment than from you. And I'm just, it's my privilege to have work with you. And, these are three just outstanding special women that have been elected. And, it was just an honor to have some role in doing that, in helping to be elected. But these are special people that are great leaders, and as I've told Tama that I feel like APA is becoming my APA because of these leaders. So I'll just stop there before I start crying. So thank you, Tama.
Thank you.